Hi, welcome to the first of many recordings for this course. What I'm going to do in this recording is I'm going to explain to you a little bit on introduction to the human body, but also in how I'm going to approach recorded lectures for this course. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the second slide. And in the second slide, what you can see is this is an overview slide. So basically in this, what you can see is that this is the name of the lecture, and then color-coded, you have three different main sections, right? So the first one is basics, the second one is functions and requirement of human life, and then the third one is level of organizations. And what I'll hope that you'll do with this information is when it comes time for you to review, that you can actually go and look at this overview slide and think, okay, do I know what the introduction says? Do I understand what metabolism is? Yes or no? Do I understand what homeostasis is? Do I understand what feedback control is? And so on and so forth. The other idea I had with the use of this slide is when you actually do practice questions, what you can do is you can print off the slide or have it open when you're doing the practice questions, and you can actually keep tally of the number of questions that you got right or wrong for each different section. So for example, if you answer a question on metabolism and you get it correct, you can just make a couple of lines over here, and you say, okay, I got the first one correct, and then 5 minutes later you come to another question on metabolism and you don't get it correct, you can put it over here, and then maybe you'll get another question on levels of anatomy. Again, you can do the same thing, you may have gotten it correct and all that kind of stuff. And so at the end of the day, what you can see is, as part of your review, you can actually see which section of this lecture you got a lot of questions correct, and which section of this lecture did you get a lot of questions wrong, right? And what you can do is you can focus on the parts of the lecture that you got the answers wrong to. And so you can actually study that again, you can read up on it, and you can focus on that. Whereas the sections that you got mostly right, you know you've got it right. And so you've got that information under control. So I thought those are two ways that you can actually use this overview slide, not only for this lecture, but for the other lectures moving forward. Slide number 3, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go through the basics of how you can make the most of your recorded lectures. So so I'm going to look at this slide, and if you look at this slide, what you can see is that the first slide of each section has got a different layout than the following slide. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. So you can see how this has got a different format. So it's got those colored bits at the top left hand as well as the bottom right hand, whereas the one before has got a solid bar along the left hand side, and you can see here the title of the slide is like that. So again, I don't want to waste slides just for a title for each section. So this is how I've chosen to do it. So in this slide, what I've got is I've got suggested strategies for you to follow when you're actually going through recorded lectures. And again, take it or leave it. These are just some suggestions that I found useful and that I got as useful feedback from my students over the years. And remember, I've been doing recorded lectures for at least over 10 years. And so I've kind of developed these do's and don'ts strategies. So the first strategy is download the slides, look through the slides beforehand, so you know how many slides in the lecture, so you know whether it's material that you're familiar with, so you know whether it's new concepts that you need to learn. So just take a quick look at the slides beforehand, right? That should only take 30 seconds, maybe a minute, just to flick through it. The second suggested strategy is that you can listen to my lectures at 1.5 speed or faster. I promise you I won't be offended. I actually do this when I'm going through material myself. I listen to things at 1.4 speed. because that seems to work for me. But I know that some students can listen and pay better attention if they listen to it faster. Third suggestion is to make notes during lectures. So make sure that your note-taking skills are up to speed. You can make notes either on slides that you've printed out beforehand. You can handwrite notes onto it, or you can type or write notes on the slides on your device, right? So sometimes what people do is they listen to the lectures on their phone and then they write the notes on their laptop. And my my fourth strategy is review your lecture notes again for 10 minutes within a day of listening to it. And this, again, not to listen to the recording, but to go through the notes that you took just so that it gets refreshed in your memory, right? So again, just 10 minutes within 24 hours when you start your study day the next day, just go through it. So those are some suggested strategies. Some pitfalls, so these are some don'ts, right? So the first one is do's, and the bottom part is don'ts, is try not to multitask. And the way that I do it is I say, okay, if I listen to the lecture 1.4 2 times the speed, then it wastes less time, and so I can actually afford not to multitask. Don't write down every single word that you hear or you think you hear, because you won't be able to do this if the lecture was being presented live in class. And again, don't rewind every time you miss a word. Doing this will make a 30-minute recording take much longer to listen to. So don't multitask, don't rewind, and don't feel like you have the need to actually write every single word that you hear or think you hear. So those are my strategies, do's and don'ts. Again, take it, leave it, cherry pick if you want. That's fine with me. So that's my strategies for listening to recorded lecture. Next slide, we're going through just the introduction. What is this course about? So as you know, the course is called Human Anatomy and Physiology. So the human part is obvious. We're going to study the human body. Anatomy is the science of the structure of an organism. So in this course, it'll be the structure of the human being and the relationship of the different parts of the human being to each other and to the larger organism. Whereas physiology is a science of how the body works, the function of the organism. So the function of each part, as well as the relationship of each part to each other and to the whole body. There is an interaction, obviously, between structure and function. So we call that a complementarity. So again, in a lot of things, what happens is the structure can be a good indicator of what the function is, right? And understanding this interaction or this complementarity between the structure and function, between anatomy and physiology, is actually the exciting part about this relationship. So instead of just looking at, say, the ear and understanding what the structure of the ear is, what the function of the ear is, and doing the same for the eye in its isolation, doing the same for the lungs and the heart and the brain and the knees and the digestive tract, instead of doing it in and knowing the structure and function of each of these different organs or tissue types in its isolation, actually understanding how they work together is really the awesome part, because then you can understand how amazing the human body is. Right? You can understand how amazing the human body is, how we can manage to do just a whole range of things because each of our body parts actually work together to make us, right? As it's the last point is anatomical structures often seem designed to perform specific functions because of the unique size, shape, form, or body location, right? So in the lungs, at its very, very smallest unit, the alveolar sacs in the lungs are only a single cell layer thick. And this means that oxygen can actually enter into the lungs, and it allows carbon dioxide to leave the lungs to go into the atmospheric air. And this very, very thin layer allows the diffusion of gas, the gases to go across the membrane very easily, right? You can imagine that it's very easy to go through one layer, whereas if you have a much thicker layer, then it would be much harder for gas exchange to occur. So structure does inform function. And so that's what we'll discover as we actually go along in this slide, in this course. The next section of this lecture is the overall, just giving you a brief overall of the functions of human life. So you can see over here, there's 7 general functions of human life. The first one is organization, and we will focus on this for this lecture, right? The body needs to be organized in order for it to maximize or optimize its function, right? So the organization of the limbs, of the legs, where the kneecaps are located, where the heart and lungs are located, where the arms are located, all those are optimized to give the maximum efficiency. So as I said, we'll focus mainly on organization in this lecture, and we'll go through and talk about all the different other functions of human life as we go through not only Human Anatomy 1, but also Human Anatomy and Physiology 2, right? The second function is metabolism. So metabolism is the ability of the body to actually create substances as well as to break down substances. So we'll see just very briefly what metabolism consists of in this lecture. And then the third one is responsiveness. We respond to whatever's going inside our body as well as whatever's going outside of our body, right? When we wake up in the middle of the night and we turn on the light, our pupils change size. When we go outside and it's the middle of winter and it's -20 and we've forgotten our jacket, we'll start shivering. When we drink a cold glass of water or 2 or 3, what happens is our body will cool down. When our heart is beating, then it moves blood around. When we go across and see a bear, what happens is our heart will beat faster in order to try to think whether we're going to run away from the bear or whether we're going to be foolhardy enough to try to fight off the bear, right? So those are things that are deemed overall as responsiveness. Movement. Our body moves, right? You've got these 3 guys running. Not only does our whole body moves, but our arms can move independently. Our fingers can clench and open. Our hearts, when it's beating, it's moving around. Our lungs are changing shape when we take in air in and out. So we've got movement of our whole body as well as its part. We also develop, right? Not only from in the fetus stage to a newborn to the whole life cycle, but also as we're becoming adults, our body does undergo growth and repair as things break down, things get fixed up, and all that kind of stuff. We see this when we get a cut on our finger, right? The cut heals. As I said, we also grow. So not only in terms of body size, but also in terms of the amount of material around the cells. And then lastly, we are also capable of reproduction. So formation of a new organism from a parent organism the act of having children, right? And how children come into being. So all these 7 things are functions of human life. I'm going to cover metabolism, the second function of human life, just in one slide, in the next slide, and then we're going to go back and talk about organization for the rest of this recorded lecture. So, metabolism can be broken down into 2 different types of reaction, right? Metabolism, I said, is the breaking down of substances as well as the creation of substances. So breaking down of substances is called a catabolic reaction. So you see over here, when we eat food, what happens is the food we eat gets broken down into much simpler substances. And so this is called catabolism, or a catabolic reaction. And in breaking down food to much simpler substances, what happens is energy is released. The other part of metabolism is an anabolic reaction, or anabolism. And I always remember the difference between catabolic and anabolic by thinking about anabolic steroids, right? People take anabolic steroids to build up their muscle. And catabolic reaction, I always think of catastrophe, right? So a catastrophe wreaks havoc, breaks things down. And so that's how I remember that. So you can see here in an anabolic reaction, what you have is you have these simple building blocks being combined together to form more complex, larger substances. And anabolic reactions require energy, right? So the term metabolism encompasses both catabolism as well as anabolism, right? And both catabolic and anabolic reactions occur simultaneously and continuously to keep you alive. As we eat, our food gets broken down into simpler substances, and depending on our body's needs, those simpler substances get formed into more complex substances that our bodies can use. In order for human life to exist, we have we require different things. So these are 4 different things that 4 different items that we require. So the first one is oxygen. We need oxygen. Oxygen enters into our body through our lungs. Oxygen is needed to produce adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is the main energy currency of our body. Our brain can die within 10 minutes if due to lack of oxygen supply, because, as I said, oxygen is needed to make ATP. ATP is needed for the brain to survive. We also require nutrients. So water is the most important nutrients. We can only survive days without it. Our body is made up of water. Water does a whole host of things that we'll learn in the next lecture. We also require nutrients as well as micronutrients, right? So micronutrients are considered vitamins and minerals, whereas nutrients that are not micronutrients are things that we eat, right? They generate energy, they maintain body processes, they help us keep healthy. The third thing is our body can also function in a fairly narrow range of temperature. So around 30 to 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is optimal body temperature, so that proteins that we're going to look at 2 lectures from now can actually be functional, so that our bodies can work. And if our body temperature drops too low, below 37 degrees, then we start shivering in order to try to get core body temperature up. If it increases too much above 37 degrees Celsius, then we start sweating in order to try to cool the body temperature down. we can also only exist within a narrow range of atmospheric pressure. And if the atmospheric pressure drops, for example, in the mountains, then we actually have problems getting enough oxygen in, and that might impair our ATP production, the amount of energy that we can create, as well as just for life in general. The next concept I'm going to cover is the concept of homeostasis. So you've got the definition of homeostasis right here, which is the ability to maintain or restore an environment at a certain level, right? So we have homeostasis is also defined as a state of steady internal conditions maintained by living things. So if you look at the graph on the right hand side, what you have here is you have blood glucose levels. So you've got blood glucose levels over here. Normal range sits between 80 to 100 mg per mil. And so that's the range. So the range is between 80 to 100 over here. And then the set point is around 90, right? The set point is the value around which normal range fluctuates. And so what happens over here is if your blood glucose levels increase, right? Again, within the normal range, then a hormone is released. Insulin is released right here to actually bring down blood glucose levels back to normal. If it drops too much, then what happens is another hormone called glucagon is released to try to bring glucose levels back up to the set point. And so what you have is you have an interplay between these two hormones to try to maintain blood glucose levels within that normal range, right? And the way that insulin and glucagon, the control of release of insulin and glucagon depends on a feedback process where it monitors a variable that constantly changes in order to actually maintain it within the normal blood glucose range. So let's look at a homeostasis control mechanism, right? So what you have here is you have these four different things. So when we look at blood glucose levels, let's say the stimulus is eating a peanut butter sandwich, right? So when we eat a peanut butter sandwich, what happens is as the sandwich gets broken down and components of it gets absorbed into our blood stream, what happens is blood glucose levels, I'm going to put BG, increases, right? And that increase in blood glucose level is detected by a sensor. And we won't go in, the sensor is part of it is in the pancreas, right? So it detects an increase in blood glucose levels, and it compares, and then it sends that signal to an integrating or control center to see, has it changed? So because of that increase in blood glucose levels with the peanut butter and peanut butter sandwich, then the pancreas will then say, yes, it needs to actually go down because blood glucose levels is going up too much. So I'm going to send a signal to the beta cells in the pancreas to release the hormone insulin, right? So insulin then would be released. So insulin is the effector, and what insulin does is it brings down blood glucose levels back to the normal range and towards the set point, right? So that's how it works over here. And then what happens is then the blood glucose levels then will actually just stay within the normal range because of this homeostasis control mechanism. So when we look at the types of feedback control mechanism that exist in the body, we see that there are two different types. The first one is a positive feedback control mechanism. So an example of this is shown in the first diagram at the top. So it's an example of uterine contraction during childbirth. So what happens with positive feedback control mechanism is it's called positive because it stimulates. It actually speeds up the process along the same road as the change that's occurring. So with childbirth, what happens is the uterus starts contracting, right? So you've got the contractions there, and what happens is as the uterus starts contracting, the baby then starts moving down the cervix, right? And as the baby starts moving down the cervix, then it stimulates the contraction and releases a um, as the baby's head moves down, then it sends a signal to the brain from the cervix, and the brain then stimulates the posterior pituitary gland to secrete a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin then travels through the blood to the uterus, and oxytocin then stimulates uterine contractions to occur faster and stronger. And what happens is, as it occurs faster and stronger, the baby is then pushed out through the uterus. And so then you've got, instead of just the head, you've got the shoulders that then sends us another signal to the brain, then secretes oxytocin, and it goes around and around and around until all of the baby exits and the baby's born, right? Once the baby's born, there's nothing actually pushing against the cervix, and so the nerve impulses then stop. When the nerve impulses from the cervix stops getting sent to the brain, then oxytocin then stops. And then when oxytocin stops being secreted, it doesn't go through the bloodstream, and then the uterine contractions then stop shortly after the baby's born, right? But the aim of this process, the aim of the positive feedback control system is to actually, in this case, to actually ensure that the baby's born, right? Another example is clotting, right? Clotting, if you have a cut on your finger, that starts a whole coagulation or clotting process, and it speeds up until a clot is formed. The same when a baby's nursing at the mom's breast. So as the baby suckles on the breast, then the breast then releases the breast milk, and it continues to do that until the baby's full and stops suckling at the mom's breast, and then that signal is lost, and so breast milk is no longer being ejected, right? So positive feedback control system is one example of a feedback control system. You can see here it's not very common at all. Whereas the second type of feedback control system is a negative control system, right? So the negative control feedback system is called negative because it is inhibitory. So it tries to bring it back down, right, in the opposite direction. So an example that I like to give is if you're driving along a road and then you see one of those signs and one of those meters that actually senses your speed as you're going by, and usually right above it, it's got what your speed should be, and usually for me it's always a little bit above what the speed should be. So say I'm going driving on Roslyn Road, see the sign and see this flashing light, and the speed is the maximum speed there should be 50. I'm doing 56. And so what happens is my negative feedback control system kicks in. I'm like, ooh, 56, much higher. I'm going to tap on the brake to try to bring me down to 50, right? So that's what a negative feedback system is. If there's too much of something, what happens is you tap on the brakes to bring that something back down to normal levels, right? So it produced an effect that's opposite to the change that activated the system. Purpose is to maintain homeostasis. How common is it? It's very common, right? So an example is if your core body temperature increases above 37 degrees Celsius, what happens is that there are nerve cells in the skin that then send a signal to the brain, and more specifically to the center in the brain that regulates temperature, and then sends a signal back down to the sweat glands throughout the body to produce sweat, and that sweat cools your body down, right? So what happens is then you keep on sweating until your body temperature goes back down to 37 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that's what a negative feedback control system does. The rest of the lecture, I'm going to go through organization of the body. So the first part is that there are different levels of anatomy in terms of the study of anatomy. So the smallest level is microanatomy or microscopic anatomy. So basically, this is the study of the body at a much smaller scale, which requires the use of equipment, either a microscope or another device, to magnify various cells or parts of the body. And so it includes cytology, which is the study of cells, and histology, which is the study of tissues. So you can see over here, this is a section of the nervous system. And so you've got neuron cells over here, and then you've got the supporting cells around, right? So that's what microanatomy or microscopic anatomy is. The next level out that's larger than microscopic anatomy is called macro. So macro is larger than micro. Micro is smaller. Or gross anatomy. So this is the study of larger structures of the body that are visible without the aid of magnification. So you see here in 2, this is a cadaver brain, right? So you can look at the brain, you can see the brain without the use of any instrumentation, right? And so what you can see is you can kind of see whether it's normal looking at a macroscopic level, whether there's enough peaks and valleys in the brain that we'll talk about later when we get to the nervous system, whether it looks normal, whether the size and shape of the body is of the brain is normal or not. And then the third level up is regional anatomy. So it's a study of interrelationships of all the structures in a specific body region. So it can be the body region can be the pelvic region or the thoracic region, or say the upper limbs, right? So, and you can see here, if you look at your upper limbs, it involves different organs, muscles, bones, nerves, and also how it interrelates to each other. And then the next level up is systemic anatomy. So you can see over here in number 4, systemic anatomy that's depicted over here is the nervous system. So you've got all the different parts of the nervous system and how they actually work together in order to actually make up a discrete body system. If we look at the next slide, we see the 7 different levels of structural organization of the human body. So from the smallest level is the chemical level, right? So, and this 7 different levels actually will actually follow throughout not only Human Anatomy 1, but also Human Anatomy 2. So next week, we're going to cover the chemical level of organization, and then we're going to go through the cellular level, then the tissue level, then the organ level, and so on and so forth. So if you look over here, what you can see, smallest level is chemical, right? So organization of atoms, molecules, macromolecules that result in living matter. And then the next level is organelles. So organelles are little tiny organs that exist inside the cell, right? So the various different organelles inside the cell function together in order to actually allow the cell to live. And then after the organelle, you've got the cellular level, and then a whole group of cells that have a specific function is called a tissue. And then you've got several different tissues that work together to form an organ. So you can see over here, the organ is the bladder, which is composed of smooth muscle tissue, right? And the bladder is then part of the urinary tract system, right? So with the system level, you've got different organs working together to perform general complex functions. And then you've got several different systems that then work together in order for our human body to actually function and survive and flourish together. If we go to the next slide, we can see all the different organ systems of the human body. And when you actually look at all these different systems, what you can appreciate is that we need all of them to actually function properly, right? So what I'm going to do is for this slide, you don't need to know all the 12 different organ systems. I'm just putting it out here just to show that your skin, your integumentary system, has certain functions, and we need the integumentary system as well as the skeletal system, your bones, as well as the muscles, as well as your nerves, as well as the endocrine, cardiovascular, lymphatic, respiratory, digestive, urinary system, and the reproductive system to actually function well, right? To function as a holistic human being. So again, if one of these systems fail, then we struggle as a human being to function at our optimum best. So we need all of them to actually function well. I'm going to then turn our attention to, again, another type of organization. And in this, what I'm going to talk about is the anatomical position. So the anatomical position is a reference position so that we know how to refer to somebody, right? So in the anatomical position, the reference position is the body is erect, so standing up, right? The arms are at the sides. So you can see here, arms are at the sides with the palms facing forward, right? So palms are facing forward. The head is also facing forward, as are the feet, right? So this is the anatomical position. In terms of a few other terms, what we have is the first term I'm going to cover is bilateral symmetry, right? Symmetry means it's the same. Lateral means sides, and bi means two, right? So when you put the phrase together, bilateral symmetry is you have two sides the same, right? So what you have here is that right and left sides are mirror image. An example of some structures in our body that exhibit bilateral symmetry are our arms, right? Right arm, left arm, our eyes, right eye, left eye, our lungs, right? Our feet, right? So when we have two of everything, one's on one side, the other one's on the other side, more likely than not, they exhibit bilateral symmetry. Ipsilateral structures are structures that are, again, lateral means side, ipsi means same, right? So ipsilateral structures are structures that are on the same side. So for example, your right hand and your right leg are ipsilateral structures. They're on the same side. Contralateral structures are structures that are on the opposite side. So again, lateral means side, contra means opposite, right? So it's opposite sides. So for example, your right hand is contralateral to your left hand because they're on the opposite sides. So again, I'm bringing this up because we will use these terms as we actually go along in this lecture. Directional terms, again, I'm introducing them to you now because we will be using these directional terms as we actually continue on in these in the human anatomy and physiology courses. So the first one is cranial and caudal, or superior versus inferior. So superior is on top, inferior is down below. Cranial is towards the head, right, which is your cranium, and caudal is towards the tail. So cauda is the tail, so caudal is towards the tail. Next one is medial versus lateral. Lateral is side, medial, think about middle, right? Medial is in the middle, right? Anterior is used interchangeably with ventral. So anterior or ventral means the front. Posterior is used interchangeably with dorsal, and it means the back, right? So when we talk about something being anterior, so your eyes are located um, anteriorly on your body, whereas your shoulder blade is located posteriorly on your body, right? Proximal versus distal. So proximal is close, distal is far away. So proximal and distal, close and far, depends on a reference point, right? So when we're talking about the body, proximal refers to what's closest to the middle of the body. So when you look over here in the arms, the shoulder is proximal relative to your fingers, which are distal, right? So again, if you look at the legs, your hip is proximal compared to your feet, which are distal, right? So again, it's relative, right? Afferent and efferent, not shown here on the picture. So afferent means going towards something, right? Towards the center, versus efferent means going away from the center, right? This afferent and efferent is used mainly in the nervous system, where you have signals from nerves that are being sent to the brain, which is referred to as afferent signal, versus signals that come from the brain going elsewhere is referred to an efferent signal. And then the last thing is right versus left. So if you look at this picture, you see that this is this person's right and this person's left, not your right or your left as you're looking at them. So right and left in the anatomical sense is the person's right or left as you're talking about them, right? Not yours. Directional terms, again, this is, again, we'll refer to these directional terms as we go along in this course. So what happens here is that there's three major planes that lie at right angles, at 90-degree angles to each other. And basically, this is something that we'll talk about, as I said, as we'll go on. So when we talk about the frontal or coronal plane, it's if you actually were to run a line from side to side all the way down, and it divides the body into a front, ventral, anterior portion, and a posterior, back, dorsal portion, right? So if you split a person via the coronal or frontal plane, it divides them into a front and a back portion. A sagittal plane, when you look over here, divides the person in, it runs through the middle from front to back and divides the person into a right and left portions. Whereas the third plane runs horizontally, so it's a transverse or horizontal plane, right? So it's this plane over here, and it divides the person into a top half and a bottom half, right? So again, we'll actually look at this as we continue on, looking at the rest of this course. And then again, speaking of looking at the rest of the course, another couple of slides is the dorsal and ventral body cavities. So cavities is basically a space, right? A hollow space. And remember, dorsal means back, right? Another word for dorsal is posterior. Ventral is the front. Another word for ventral is anterior. So basically, we've got hollow spaces in the back and hollow spaces in the front. So the hollow space in the back is called the dorsal or posterior body cavity, and it's divided into two smaller ones. And the two smaller cavities are the cranial cavity that contains the brain, right, the cranium, and the spinal or vertebral cavity that contains the spinal cord. Right? So the brain and the spinal cord are what are contained in the dorsal cavity. The cavity in the front is called the ventral or anterior cavity. Again, it's divided into two smaller cavities. So the first cavity is the one on top. It's called the thoracic cavity, and that contains the lungs and heart. And the bottom cavity is the abdominal pelvic cavity and contains digestive, reproductive, and urinary organs. And it's separate out, the thoracic cavity is separated from the abdominal pelvic cavity by the diaphragm. So the diaphragm forms the floor of the thoracic cavity and separates it from the abdominal pelvic cavity. So out of these cavities, right, all of them are protected by bones except for the abdominal cavity, right? This is the only cavity that's not protected by bones. Your pelvic cavity is somewhat protected by the pelvic bones. Your cranial cavity is protected by your skull. Your vertebral cavity is protected by the vertebrae. Your thoracic cavity is protected by the rib cage, right? So only your abdominal pelvic cavity is mostly not protected by bones. And then the last slide is the membranes of the anterior or body cavity. So a membrane is basically a thin layer. The serous membrane or the serosa, thin layers that cover the walls and organs in the anterior cavity. So that contains most of your body's organs, with the exception of your brain and your spinal cord. And what happens is you have a sac in the middle. In this case, it's the pericardial cavity that is filled with fluid. And that fluid and that cavity helps to cushion and reduce friction on internal organs when they move, right? So the pericardial cavity that surrounds the heart contains pericardial fluid, and that reduces friction as the heart is always moving. When it beats, every time a heart beats, contracts and relaxes, it's moving. And so it produces heat and friction if in the absence of the pericardial cavity. So what happens is, as I said, the serous membrane has two layers. The first one is the visceral layer that you can see over here that covers the organ. So the visceral layer that covers the heart is called the visceral pericardium. And then you've got the other layer, the outside layer, which is called the parietal layer, and that lines the walls of the cavity. So in the heart, it's called the parietal pericardium. And in the middle, you've got the cavity that contains fluid. Serous membrane that covers different organs have different names. So for example, the serous membrane that covers the lungs is called the pleura. The one that covers the heart is called the pericardium, as we saw in this slide. And the one that covers the organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity is called the peritoneum or peritoneum, right? So that's it for your first lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it.